Hi guys, we have selected an infinity range figure that are those from a video game from Disney that personally I think that are perfect to study volumetry, volumes, how to understand volumes. And because it's a video that we were willing to do for a long time, and well, I think that this will be super useful for all of you, especially for the beginners or even the more advanced painters that has been focused all their lives in a technical perspective, but that they still don't know how to interpret the volumes in an illustrative way, let's say, which at the end, is the easiest way to make something stands out, right? Normally, the only tips about how to understand volumes that we have consumed over the years, they were either the zenithal source light technique from a frontal view, which is nothing wrong, but it's very simplistic, and definitely not realistic, and also Games Workshop style, which is good for gaming and it's perfectly fine, but it's not realistic at all, obviously, and indeed they don't have even a proper illumination. Like, for example, those Space Marines that looks really nice, they're beautiful for gaming, but those are basically flat colors with no illumination and just edge lining or edge highlighting, and that's it. They look beautiful, but from a painting perspective, it's not complex, it's not well interpreted, and makes no sense. So we have to differentiate. They have a really good definition, good painters that paints in a very technical way, but the illumination don't respond to any specific source light. So why we're going to use first of all a zenithal source light? Because the reason is that this zenithal source light concept is based on the theater, and when the theater became to be more popular, in the late Renaissance and Baroque, they wanted to enhance the expressivity, the expression of the actors, and they did it by the illumination, So by doing this zenithal source light focus, the people that were looking the theater performance, the people that were in the background, they could see it and understand it easily because the zenithal source light is done to enhance expression. So it's not realistic, it's just something expressive. And the reason why we interpreted the miniatures in a zenithal source light is because 20 years ago, Raúl García La Torre brought this zenithal source light, among others, but especially him, also Rodrigo Hernández Chacón and a few others, and they brought this zenithal source light interpretation that comes from the theater, as I have said, to enhance the volumes more, because before the miniatures were interpreted in a general way, right? So we have to interpret the figure like if it was a 2D canvas, right? Or a 2D picture. And this doesn't mean that this has to work only in a picture. No, don't get me wrong. This means that we have to focus on a 2D main view, because that will be the easiest way to start interpreting the figure. Indeed, our eye and our brain, however we perceive really well the depth, right? We see from flat planes, right? So that's the reason why if we discover the depth of the volumes from one view, then we can make it more complex by adding more views in the future. But now we're going to focus on two zenithal source lights. And the reason why we have picked this figure is because those are super simple, very funny, very fun to paint, easy volumes, and the volumetries are super easy to interpret and understand, and indeed they are fantastic sculpts. So congratulations to the sculptors, probably a 3D sculptor that made a fantastic characterization, and it looks awesome, sincerely. I mean, that's the reason why, because of all the concepts we're going to explain are based on basic volumes or basic geometrical volumes. That's the reason why we have picked this one as a reference. So we're going to create several videos speaking about volumetry, going from this more simple that David has produced already to the more complex that you will see in the future for a total illustration style that works in 360 degrees, right? But for the moment, we're going to stay attached to one main point of view, that this will be enough to create a fantastic artwork, as I can promise you this. Indeed, 90% of my box arts are sketched in this way and are, you know, like thought or pre-conceptualized in this way, right? So this view, it has several angles that works really well. So we will have to choose which views we will select as the main ones and which ones we will sacrifice in favor of the main ones, right? Like for instance, if we want to enhance that view, obviously in the next picture, that will be this one, the illumination will be placed on a lateral side of the arm, right? So it won't be frontal, it will be lateral, right? So that's the reason why you have to be clever and search for the views that the viewer that will hold the figure in his hand, he will search unconsciously, he will search for certain views that these are the ones that you have to select wisely in order to enhance the figure in the best way possible. And obviously this is a matter of experience, and you have to start thinking and reflecting about those views by studying the picture, studying the figure, right? And this is something applied on cinema, photography, canvas painting, sculpting, everything, right? Choosing the right view is always so important. So the main view will be the starting point. Towards all the other views will rotate and will enhance or become more complex, right? So this one, for example, could be a very interesting view, but to me it's not the most interesting because the arm is covering the chest. So in this case, I prefer to go for this lateral view that is more readable somehow. And however the arm or the hand is still covering certain part of the chest and the belly, I have more information. But this is obviously a very personal point of view. So if you want to choose the other perspective, this is up to you. And indeed, in between professionals, like me and Mark Masclans, we have been speaking yesterday about a new piece I have sculpted, and his selection for the main box art was different than mine, and both of them will work. Also, will depend on how will you paint it, you know, and how dramatic you will be, how contrasted you will be, etc. Here, the problem is that you have to select which views you will somehow reject because they look maybe unstable, like this one, or maybe because the composition is not so strong, or maybe because you cannot see important elements like the face or the hands, or so those reasons you have to think them properly, right? And this selection is very important. Indeed, I'm tired of seeing many great paintings in contests that they have to judge with terrible compositions and terrible main views selections that will go completely against the final result of a maybe fantastic painting, right? So what we will do is to simplify the more complex volumes into a simpler versions of geometry. And then another important concept is the focus, right? From where the light comes. However, light bounces and comes almost from everywhere in different degrees or in different intensities and different tones, because depends on where it bounces, it will reflect one color or not. Depends on the material, depends on the drama, on the effect that you want to represent, etc. So everything else, can affect the illumination, and that's the reason why we cannot stay attached just to a zenithal source light. As you can see, the zenithal source light that comes from the sun will bounce light almost everywhere. but we tend to make a focal point because it's better for an illustrational intention, you know. Normally in the past, like 10 or 15 years ago, we used to search for a one directional zenithal point light, like a 3/4 point or maybe a frontal one. And with this, it will be enough. And this is how we painted 10 years ago. You can check many of those box arts for Andrea miniature scale 75, night models, even night models. Well, night model was a little bit more complex later, but this was like the initial concept. Indeed, nowadays there are fantastic artworks like Marmas Clan's ones that they normally goes with a more general source light and it's not something super dramatic. So at the end, it's a matter of taste and what do you want to represent, right? So when the illustration style came to the miniature world, that started for sure with Kirill Kanaev and also night models. Like for example, this example, the Red Skull, is a figure that it doesn't work in 360. Is one of the figures I like the most, and I think it's really well resolved. The box art I did for night models, but this has two focal lights, one that hits the front and one that hits the back, and that's it. Because the figure itself is very flat. The composition it works in a flat point of view, so it's not necessary to become crazy searching for 300 angles that works perfectly with different source lights, with different bones of light, with rim lights. No, guys. Sometimes being more simplistic will create a fantastic artwork, or even better, you know. And you have to decide which miniature deserves to be more complex than others, right? Like for example, this one, the Ghost Rider, which is one of my milestones probably over my career, and that had a real impact in the miniature world, like 9 years ago. This is I think from 2011 or something like this, and this is basically the composition of I don't remember how many, but 8, 9, maybe 10 different views that works perfectly, and in different angles you can understand perfectly how the illustration works. And when I speak about understanding, it's about reading. You know, this is like a book. You have to be able to read all the volumes and what is happening in the scene, what I'm trying to transmit in the scene from different angles. So basically what I'm doing here is a game of placing or taking decisions for 9, 10, 11 different views, and then the brain will connect all of them and it will create, or it will believe that it's a complete 360 volumetry that works perfectly, right? So I think it's important that you learn and that you know that this exists. This is something that also Kirill Kanaev is doing constantly, also many other painters, especially now that the illustration style has been developed so much. And indeed, I'm going to show you indeed another infinity figure with a grisaille, which this is not sketchy style. This is called grisaille, which is a post late Renaissance technique for sculpting, for low relief. And this is based on achieving or bringing up the volumetry in a simplistic way that works only in a value level, you know, in a level of brightness, you know, a level of black and white, the grayscale basically, right? So when you see this, you will see how it works and how it looks like a comic black and white drawing, generating the idea of a volume and perspective without a very complex interpretation, you know, just by working with different planes of gray that guide the eye towards a good reading. So where do you place the light and how do you brushstroke in this case the grisaille or the colors, depending on what is the technique you want to work with. The final goal is to make the eye understand easily how are these volumes. And in this case, if you see different angles, you will see that it's easily understandable. So this was a very quick exercise I did in Roman Lapat Massive Voodoo studio a while ago. And this is a 15 minutes exercise that is perfectly understandable and is a perfect shape to practice volume, right? So I suggest you to pick one of those and start practicing with them, because they are also very cheap. You can find them on Amazon or maybe eBay or something like this for a very cheap price for the people from the people that they don't play anymore. And then obviously there are many examples out there from great illustrators that give you their guides of how to illuminate, how to use the light to highlight volumes. But if you see different interpretations from different artists, you will see how all of them interpretates. None of them are doing the same in the same way. However, they have some things in common. I don't know the name of this guy. Unfortunately, I ask for forgiveness for this, for not knowing the name. Otherwise, I will tag them as it has to be. But you know, it's a very simple way to understand how to interpret the volume. But here, obviously, it's a 2D, and you have a lack of information. So also the thing is, what does he wants to represent? Because obviously you don't perceive the same way the girl that is in the first position than the one who has the blue spot, where the face looks a little bit older and more sharp. And you know, like this example as well, those are all interpretation. None of them are working perfectly because none of them are based on real volumes, and those are simplifications. So don't stay attached to this, because none of them are realistic. We have to start differentiating make the difference between something realistic and something believable. Something believable is what we see, let's say, in a video game like this, or in an animation movie, but it's not realistic, you know, because we are not considering real volumes here, you know. We're just reinterpreting towards a specific goal that could be an environmental goal, or creating, like an ambience or a mood, a feeling, or maybe a character to enhance certain characteristics or attitudes of the character, right? So I recommend you that when you check those things that are out there, you can find them easily on Google, right? Take them, you know, not like if it were the truth, instead of only like a guide that you can interpret it. Indeed, I prefer those more simplistic versions, because that will lead you to reinterpret it by yourself. Because, you know, for example, here he's playing almost with symmetry, which is something very difficult. However, it's very well explained. At the end, all of them are interpretation, because it's really difficult to find a real situation in the nature where all the lights are, let's say, symmetrical, for example. That doesn't work normally in this way. And there are many other factors, many different bouncing lights or reflections of other elements that are not under a strict control of a studio photography studio display, like this one of the bald guy, right? So something that is very obvious and that most of the time we don't take into account when it's so easy as taking a picture of yourself with a certain illumination, but you have to reinterpret it always in searching for the goal of enhancing the beauty of the figure, right? So indeed you can see how the features change completely, and the attitude of the character, or even the mood and the spirit of the character change in terms of how do you interpret the different levels of contrast, levels of light, and how you place the lamps, let's say, or the focal light spots to enhance certain volumes or not. So obviously the selection of the focus is so important, and it always has a very narrative character somehow. It's a narrative election, right? Because, for instance, if you want to do something creepy, you will use maybe the fourth starting from the top, or the third starting from the top, and this would be a more aggressive interpretation that will change the character of the guy. So there are many different ways to illuminate, and each one will respect certain volumes but will hide some others, and each one will offer you a certain dramatization, certain dramatic effect, or not, you know. So it has to be you who decide how far you want to go. Me, I'm just showing you different examples and different ways to interpret it, because many people that I find in my classes, they don't even know where to search for documentation, right? So all these documentations, you can find it on Google. It's super easy to find them, but you have to understand that the most important thing is not to have the elements to play with, instead of which elements you select to play with. I don't know if this is clear or not, but what I'm trying to say here is that which illumination will be better to show, for example, this girl. And now the answer is, what do you want to represent with this girl? Do you want to represent someone sweet, tender, nice, funny, or do you want to make something aggressive, like a cold beauty or something like this? So it all depends on your personal choices, and those personal choices will lead you to a certain decision that will place the figure in a specific context or not, right? And because I have seen that most of the people, they just pick a miniature and they try to paint it or colorize it in a more beautiful way, but most of you don't create a specific character, and that's the main lack of many hobbyists, right? That they don't do a previous study of what do they want to represent. Like, for example, if we want to represent with different photographies that all of them are taken from more or less the same perspective, right? Like, for example, here, these features of this girl has been flattened, because the goal of it is to show someone that has been makeup, because she wants to hide any wrinkle, failure, dot, blister, whatever, right? So obviously, if you want to do something that looks like the idealization of the beauty, maybe this frontal flashlight is a fake interpretation that don't belong to reality, because when you see this woman, even with this makeup, out of this picture, she won't look like this, right? But this could be a nice interpretation if what you want to represent is this kind of super smooth feeling of a geisha, right? Something like beautiful that is near to perfection, or the wrong idea of perfection, right? But in this case, it's not only a lack of failure, but it's also a lack of contrast, right? While this one that is a similar point of view, this is also a frontal point of view, but here they are bringing much more contrast, right? And this contrast is creating a difference, a big difference, because her is so beautiful as well, but she's more aggressive, you know, she's more sexy than childish somehow. Look, both elections are good, and now it depends on what is the aesthetic that you want to generate, right? But obviously, if we want to generate more drama, look at this one. Here, it looks almost like a silhouette of a drawing. It looks almost like a two-dimensional piece, because they are rescuing the shape of the neck by illuminating the background and darkening the lateral sides. Like it almost generates a silhouette with like a trace of a feather or a pen or something like this, right? But the lateral side of the face is completely flattened, and it has a big lack of volume, because they want to enhance just the silhouette, and it looks more feminine. Like, for example, in this one is something different, because the goal is completely the opposite. The goal here is an ambience goal, and we're playing with different contrast, not only light and shadow, instead of also background and shape, and also different tonalities. So it's a tonal contrast, but also a temperature contrast. So much more elements bring much more contrast, much more different interpretations, and all of them are perfectly fine if you are representing the right character. You know, what doesn't make sense is that you're painting a very angry orc in the battlefield that has been painted in a super smooth frontal focal point, because that doesn't represent well the character that you are bringing to the table, right? Well, if we want drama or something like this, you can see something like this. For example, this is a fat guy, and normally he will have a very soft and rounded volumes, but as soon as you place the light from below, from the bottom, the image looks much more aggressive, or that one from myself many years ago in Raul Torres' studio. This is a funny picture, and you can see how here all the focal point makes a very interesting gradient of different levels of light, right? And the light is not hitting me from a frontal point of view, or even not like a direct zenithal source light, instead of something that hits me from only the sides. Well, this is just the first part of this explanation. I hope you find it enjoyable, because this will continue in a second video. If you find all those ideas interesting, please tell us in the comment box and give us some likes on the video, because we will appreciate that. And tell me if you find these thoughts something that can be valuable for your learning. Thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.